I'm going to begin today with an anonymous poem, and it's called The Pit. A man fell into a pit and couldn't get himself out. A subjective person came along and said, "I feel for you down there." An objective person walked by and said, "It's logical that someone would fall down there." A Pharisee said, "Only bad people fall into pits." A mathematician calculated how deep the pit was. A news reporter wanted the exclusive story on the pit. A self-pitying person said, "You haven't seen anything till you've seen my pit." A fire and brimstone preacher said, "You deserve your pit." A Christian scientist observed, "The pit is just in your mind." A charismatic said, "Just confess you're not in the pit." A realist said, "Now that's a pit." A psychologist noted, "Your mother and father are to blame for your being in that pit." A self-esteem therapist said, "Believe in yourself and you can get out of that pit." An optimist said, "Things could be worse." A pessimist claimed, "Things will get worse." Jesus, seeing the man, took him by the hand and lifted him out of the pit. It's always good, isn't it, to end on good news? We all like happy endings. That was just a poem. But the Bible does talk about God lifting us out of pits, and that's great news. But here's the thing, it will be at exactly the right time. And I sort of hear that collective sigh from us all, because we instinctively know that God's timing isn't ours. And so today we're in the next chapter of the story of Joseph, and we're continuing to trace his story in one of the darkest moments of his life. That God had plans for Joseph, there's no doubt, but God needed to make him ready for those plans. And to get a man ready, the pit is usually the way. And if not a pit, then a problem. And in Joseph's case, prison. But God's plans were still in place. The pit and the prison and the problems were part of it. I mean, who'd have thought? All those times when we look back in our own lives, not understanding the circumstances that we found ourselves in and the lessons that we were to learn. And so we're embarking on a roller coaster journey of 13 years of Joseph's life, 13 years from when he had those dreams from God and them coming to pass. Theologians have worked it out as an approximation, 13 years. What goes on between God revealing his great plan for Joseph and them actually coming to pass? What goes on in the meantime? All of us today are living in the meantime. If you're a Christian today, then you know that this isn't it. Here on earth isn't home. Home is waiting for us when we die. So here on earth, we are living in the meantime. Someone once said that in life, we've either just come out of a problem, we're about to go into another problem, or we're in the middle of one. And that is life for us all. And it seems that we are always, as it were, waiting in the middle for problems, circumstances to pass. And the waiting is the hardest thing, because in the waiting, doubts creep in. Has God forgotten? Is he really there? I mean, is he doing something? What am I supposed to do while I'm waiting? What do we do in these dark seasons in life when we wait and pray and God doesn't seem to be doing anything? Point number one, and I actually don't have any more points today. Point number one, God tests us in many ways, but the biggest test is remaining faithful in the meantime. Here's Joseph today. We're in chapter 40. He's in prison and he's been put in charge of all his fellow inmates. And one day 2 more arrived there from the royal household, the butler and the baker. And they'd been thrown in there. It says in chapter 40, verse 3, they were thrown in the place where Joseph was confined. Joseph, who was the favourite son of his father Jacob, Joseph, of whom God had great plans for, Joseph, who'd been given those dreams from God, was confined in a prison. He'd been confined in a pit. He'd been confined in shackles. He was confined in slavery, and now he's confined in a prison. Now, we may not be sent physically to a prison, and I hope that we're not, but we all know what it feels like to be confined by situations that we find ourselves in life. Confined by life's circumstances, by problems that we face and we have to handle. We may feel confined by weaknesses that we feel that we have, or insecurities. We may even feel confined by another person. And I wonder today, can we believe that we could right at this moment be exactly where God wants us to be? God had a plan for Joseph, but as we've heard in the past weeks, there's nothing worse than a man succeeding before he's ready. And God needed to get Joseph ready. There were some corners to knock off, and the pit was the way. And if not the pit, then the problems, and for Joseph, the prison. Someone called Zig Ziglar said this: "It's your attitude, not your aptitude, that determines your altitude." We're encouraged in the book of Philippians chapter 2 to have a Christ-like attitude, to be like-minded with Christ. And the Bible has so much to say about attitude. There are attitudes that God resists and attitudes that he regards and exhorts us to have. Our attitude is important. And I'm sure that we've all come across people who have been promoted beyond where their character can keep them. We can have all the positions in the world and all the giftings going, but if our attitude stinks, we've had it. And attitude is best revealed in the meantime. Joseph was confined. It was God who confined him. But God's plan was still in place. When we're confined like that and waiting, well, there's nothing to do except wait. Is there? Well, I'm hoping that today we'll see that there is, and we need to take a leaf out of Joseph's book. Here he was in prison. He'd done nothing to deserve confinement, but nonetheless he found himself paying the price. And you'd think that that would be enough to make him angry or even bitter, even self-pity, a bit of self-pity or doubt and unbelief. But despite all that Joseph was going through, there's no evidence that he doubted God. In fact, he trusted him, he kept his faith and kept a good attitude. His attitude was based on the certainty of God's faithfulness. He kept a good attitude, a God attitude. And he was given the top jobs wherever he found himself. Maintaining a good attitude is everything. And so today, let's take the butler and the baker, for example, and we find Joseph showing them care and compassion. It says he noticed they were sad. Well, when you think about it, they were all in prison. You'd think they'd be sad every day, but Joseph noticed that this one day they were particularly sad. Here they are, they're all confined together, but it was Joseph who could have been forgiven for sitting licking his own wounds, mulling over his own plight. If he had, he would have missed a God opportunity, but he was focused on others despite his predicament. Not only that, having been given the top job in there, he could have easily used his position to get these two men to serve him. Instead, he reaches out to serve them. Attitude. And it says that God made all that Joseph did to prosper. In fact, this is what it says in the story of Joseph. Several times it says the Lord was with him, that he had favor, that he prospered in all that he did, that he had success. And not only that, those around him were blessed because of him. Attitude. Who'd have thought? God's presence, God's favor, God's prosperity, God's blessing in confinement. His presence, favor, prosperity, and blessing in the meantime. God is just as interested in our meantime as he is on the end goal. And so what can we learn from Joseph's pit today? God is still with us. In fact, he said he'll never leave us or forsake us. God is still with us. There's no place that his presence can't penetrate. Though we may be confined, we can still know freedom in him. Though we are confined, God can still use us. Attitude is everything. Though imprisoned, we can still show concern and compassion for others. We can serve others. We can still be favored of God. We can still be on track concerning God's plans for our lives. God can still speak to us. We're ambassadors for him wherever we find ourselves, and God's giftings are still in operation. Joseph hadn't forgotten his relationship with God, despite the fact that he was confined. God works in all areas of our lives, and he wants us to be willing to share our faith with those on the outside of him. Joseph here in chapter 40, he's amongst the Egyptians. They're a godless people, but God was working amongst them. He spoke to two of them through dreams, and he perfectly placed Joseph to interpret them. How easily Joseph could have missed that opportunity if he'd have had a bad attitude, if he'd have been busy blaming God for his situation. In the pit, God taught him humility. He taught him to serve. He taught him to be faithful. He taught him patience. He taught him that it's God alone who accomplishes his purposes in our lives. He taught him that God alone is in control. He taught him that God indeed does fulfill his promises. He taught him that God's timing is everything. How did he teach him that? Well, remember Joseph's last words to the butler? After he'd interpreted his dream, he defended himself, and he said, "Don't forget me when you get out." And the butler did. And that's where chapter 40 ends. And here we see Joseph suffering another wrong. Joseph learned that he couldn't force the hand of God. He couldn't force God's timing. And neither can we. We can't get ourselves out of a pit. What pit or problem are you in this morning? What situation are you in that you have no control over? Someone said this: all men that God uses greatly, he first prepares greatly. Few are willing to endure the greatness of God's preparation. God was in both the steps and stops of Joseph's life. And waiting is the hardest part. But you know what? God is our deliverer. He alone is our deliverer. The Apostle Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians, He says this, that God delivered them and he'll deliver us again. That's what he says. He said, on him we've set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. In other words, God isn't going to give up on his job of deliverer. He is our deliverer. He is your deliverer. In chapter 40, it seems as though God is missing because he's not recorded as speaking directly in that chapter. And it's reminding us that sometimes God chooses to stay silent. But his silence doesn't mean his absence. We've heard that probably every week in the roller coaster series. God's silence doesn't mean his absence. Tim Keller wrote a book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And this is what he said. In all the years when absolutely everything seemed to go wrong for Joseph, was God not there? No, he was there and he was working. He was hidden, but he was also in complete control. Joseph did come out of the pit eventually, not because of the butler, but because God, in his wisdom and sovereignty, in his timing, ordained it. Let's not regard pits and problems as some strange occurrences or something that's been sent by the enemy to stop us in our tracks, but rather as a sign that God is at work in our lives. In the meantime, attitude is everything. Good attitude, a God attitude that is based on the certainty of his faithfulness and deliverance. The time will come when God will stretch out his hand and bring you out. A time will come when he'll lift you out of that pit, that problem, that confinement. I don't know if you remember in Psalm 40, David wrote the psalm, and here was another man that God brought out of a horrible pit. At the right time, it says he took him out, and it says he was rejoicing. Was it because God took him out? Well, probably. Or was he rejoicing because of what God had done in him in the pit? Because it says that he came out and he stood on solid ground. He had a new song in his mouth. All his goings were established. He came out delighting in doing God's will. It says God got his word into David's heart. And you know what? There's nothing like a pit for doing that. In the meantime, let's not worry. His presence is with us. His favor is on us. If we trust him, he will prosper us and bless those around us. Let's embrace him in the meantime and enjoy the white knuckle ride of the roller coaster of life. God bless you.